want to do today is I want to look at some of the newest material that's come out, and probably the best apologetic we're getting in the last 2 years are these two questions right here. What do we do with the beginning? How did Islam begin? And what is it we're finding out now from the historical critique concerning how Islam began? And where did the Quran come from? Where did the Quran come from? Now, when you look at Islam, you know that the claims they make is that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet. I don't think any Muslim you meet will say any differently, whether they are conservative, whether they are nominal, whether they are liberal. They all start with that premise that Muhammad is the last and greatest, the seal of all prophets. And the Quran is the final revelation. It is the revelation that corrects the other revelations. The others have been abrogated by the Quran. And that Islam is the final religion, it's the final faith. It's the faith that corrects that which has been corrupted, that which has been abrogated from before. You get that out of Surah 2, Ayah 106, and Surah 16, Ayah 101. Now, when I say Surah, I mean book. When I say Ayah, I mean verse. So that would be book 2, verse 106, and book 16, verse 101. Now, let's take that on hand, and let's assume that that's their premise. Therefore, Islam is completely dependent on those two notions. They're completely dependent on the Prophet Muhammad, and they're completely dependent on the book called the Quran. It's a revealed text that they're looking to, and it's also a model of that text, the person of Muhammad. Now stop and ask yourself, do we not start from the same premise? Do we also start with the revealed text? Yes, we do. And do we also start from a model of that revealed text? And of course, what is our text? Our text is the Bible, and more specifically for Christians, it's the New Testament. And of course, the model for that would be Jesus Christ. So in some ways, we start from the same paradigm, and that's why in some ways we are the best to be able to engage with them, and we are the best to then take them on board on these very two things. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to look at the text, and I'm going to look also at the person of Muhammad. Now let's investigate. What do we know about Muhammad? Well, this is the classical model. This is what you have been taught, and if you haven't been taught something other, then tell me. But this is what I have heard for the last 30 years, that Muhammad was born in 570, that he went to a cave called the Jibril cave. Not the Hira cave, where Jibril met him. That's Gabriel, the angel, and told him to Aqra, to recite. He said, Ma Aqra, I cannot recite. He did that 3 times. 3 times the angel squeezed him. He then went back, let him released. He went back to Mecca and told his wife Khadija what had just happened. She had him sit on one leg and tested him to make sure that he was telling the truth. She had him sit on another leg, tested him again. When he still said that was the truth, she then disrobed in front of him and did a 3rd time. Once she realized that he was telling the truth all 3 times, she went and had introduced him to Waraka ibn Nawfal, her cousin, who was an Nestorian Christian. It was he then said, truly you are our prophet. Isn't that one of the ironies of history? The man that gave him his injunction as a prophet was a Christian. Fascinating, and that all happened in 610. So from 610 then till 622, he received these revelations, and these are known as the Meccan revelations. And you look at the Quran, if you just divide it in half, it's the latter half of the Quran, basically from Surah 21 up until Surah 114. That's known as the Meccan revelations. In 621, he was woken up in the middle of the night. He was told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak. He was flown up to Jerusalem, and there, where the Dome of the Rock is today, that rock, he then ascended the 7 heavens up and met Allah, and Allah told him to pray 50 times a day. He came down 2 heavens to the 5th heaven, met Moses. Moses asked him how many times he was to pray. He was told 50. He said, that's too many, see if you can get it down. So he bounces back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven, back between Moses and Allah, and getting it down from 50 to 45, down to 35, 30, down to 15, 10, and finally 5 prayers. So, once it got down to 5 prayers, Moses says that's enough, and he heads on back down to earth. Ironically, again, it's Moses who is the one that gives us 5 prayers. That happens in 621. In 622 then, he leaves Mecca and goes up to Medina, and that's called the Hijrah, the Exodus. And that's the beginning of the Muslim calendar, and that's why when you go to a Muslim today, we're in about 1343, I think is the year that we're in today. That starts from 622, when the Muslim calendar begins. To arbitrate between the Jews and the Arabs that are there, there's an awful lot of bad blood between the 2 groups. And for 2 years, he makes an alliance with the Jews. That alliance only lasts for 2 years until 624. When that alliance breaks down, he then starts attacking the Jews, and he gets rid of the 3 major Jewish tribes, the Banu Kunuka in 624, the Banu Nadir in 625, and then finally in 627, the Banu Qurayza, the largest and most influential Jewish family. Now, once that happens, he then has complete control of Medina. And for the next 8 years, he then starts using the sword. And that's where the campaigns, that's where the raids begin. And from 624 to 632, the last 8 years of his life, he's involved in 29 battle campaigns, and he plans another 33 on top of that. So his whole life was imbued with violence for the last 8 years of his life. But he receives these revelations. And if you look at the revelations, the Medinan revelations, that's where all the violence is. And it's the first 20 chapters that are problematic for Muslims because they're full of violence. Verse after verse after verse, 150 verses that deal with violence. So when Muslims tell you that the Quran is a book of peace, ask them which Quran they're talking about. 630, he then dies suddenly, like many people tend to do. We don't know how he died. Some traditions say he died through poisoning. Nonetheless, when he died, the Quran had not been written down. It was completed at that time in 632. Sorry, 630 he conquered Mecca. 632 he died. I jumped ahead of myself there. When he died and the Quran had not been written down, that was a problem. Because if it had not been written down, then what Quran are we talking about? And there were a number of people who had heard him recite it, who had memorized it. Some of it had been written on stones, others had written on bones and leaves and bark, but nothing had been written down on a vellum or on a parchment at that time. And people who had memorized it were dying. In fact, at the Battle of Yamamah in 633, many of those who had memorized the Quran had died in that battle, and that's why Abu Bakr, the caliph at that time, wrote the Quran down. So that's the first recension of the Quran that we know, written between 633 and 634. Keep that date in your mind, all right? Abu Bakr is the first to write it down. He dies peacefully. He's the only one of the first 4 caliphs that dies peacefully. Umar takes over, and that's where the expansion begins. The expansion that moves out of the Hijaz, a central part of Arabia that includes Mecca and Medina, moves up and takes over the entire peninsula. But more than that, he then takes over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, these 5 great cities of the Levant, and he starts moving out over and through northern Africa. So that's where the expansion starts to begin. Now, you're not taught about this in your history books, are you? You're not talking about the Islamic conquest at all. It's not in our history books. Uthman then comes to power in 644, and during the time of Uthman, in around 650, so we're talking the mid-7th century, in 650, the Quran is rewritten again. This time they take the original copy that was put together by Abu Bakr and was kept under the bed of one of Muhammad's wives named Hafsa. That copy then is taken out and rewritten again by 4 men, Zayd ibn Thabit, Alas, Zubair, and Harith. The 4 of them rewrite the Quran again in 650 under the auspices of Uthman. That is known as the Uthmanic recension. And that's what Muslims are quoting today. When you talk to a Muslim and they talk about the Quran, they're talking about that Quran, the time of Uthman. But that's 18 years after Muhammad is dead that the Quran is finally written down. 4 copies are made. 1 was left in Medina, 1 was sent to Basra, 1 was sent to Baghdad, and 1 was sent to Damascus. So 4 copies of the original Quran were sent. We're going to talk a little about that when we get to the slide later on. But nonetheless, just to introduce that, and then of course when Uthman is killed in 656, Ali comes to power. He is the legitimate heir to Muhammad because he is the adopted son of Muhammad, the only one that's adopted son of Muhammad. And of course, he is the one that the Shiites look to as the legitimate heir. And that's where you have the problem between Shiism and Sunni because of Ali. Now, anybody heard any different? This is just the bare bones. I'm just giving you quickly, just to do an overview. This is the classical model of how Islam began, how the Quran began, what the importance of Muhammad is. Have you heard anything else? You've heard many other stories above and beyond that, but is this the classical model that's taught everywhere? Would you doubt it? Is there any reason to doubt it? No. Nothing really to doubt, because this is what we've been taught for 1400 years. 1400 years. Interesting. Take a look and see. Everything I've just told you, where do you think it came from? Where would you have liked to have come from? Who Muhammad was, when he was born, when he moved to Medina, what happened between there and Mecca, all these stories about his wife and about Jibril and the cave, the Hira, and about the difficulties with Abu Bakr and Uthman and Ali. Where would you like to have happened? Certainly the story of Muhammad himself, from 570 up until 632. Who would you think would be the best equipped to write down that story? People that knew him, right? You would hope so, right? So when's the first biography ever written down? Ibn Ishaq, 765. Muhammad died in 632. Do you see a problem there? We don't have Ibn Ishaq's material. None of that exists today. We have to go to another man named Ibn Hisham, who gets it from a disciple of Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Hisham is the first one to write down the biography of the Prophet. known as the Sirah of the Prophet, Siratu Rasulullah. So the first biography of Muhammad does not appear until 833 for a man that died in 632. It takes them 200 years to write down the first biography. Now the sayings are even more important. What Muhammad said is absolutely important. Every Muslim, in order to know how they are to walk, talk, eat, drink, sleep, everything they're to do is based on the sayings of the Prophet. And the man they go to is Al-Bukhari. He's the first to write down the compilations of the hadith. He writes them. He was given 600,000 of these sayings, and he goes through and whittles them down until he gets down to 7,397. In other words, he throws out 98% of it and only keeps 2%. And that he wrote down between 850 and 870. That's 240 years after the Prophet's life. Nothing is written down before that time from that genre that's complete. Now, there are others that write down after him, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, and others, but not before 870. That all comes after 870. Now, if you want to understand how to read the Quran, because when you read the Quran, and I hope you have read the Quran, did it make much sense to you? Did it have any complete stories? There's only one complete story in the entire Quran, and that's in Surah 12, the story of Joseph. The rest of the Quran is ulta all over the place, difficult to understand, and therefore you need something to handle, and you need to have commentaries. And the commentaries are first put together by Al-Tabari. And look at the date for Al-Tabari. The date for Al-Tabari is not till 923. So the first compilation of the commentaries don't begin till 923. That's the 10th century. Then you have many that come after. But let's go back and look at those dates. That means everything that's happening, and I'm going to come over here. Is it okay with the camera if I come over here? Everything that's happening over here doesn't get written down until here. 200 to 300 years after the fact. Does that bother any of you? That should bother all of you. Take a look at Jesus Christ. Does he not also have a Sirah? Is there not the Sirah of Jesus Christ, the biography of Jesus Christ? Yes, there is. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus dies in 33 AD. We already have letters about Jesus already from Paul's letters. They're within the 48 to 64 AD. We have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So 3 of the Gospels are already written within 30 years of Christ's death. One of them, Matthew, knew Jesus Christ personally. The Gospel of John is written around 90 AD, so certainly within 60 years of Christ's death, you have 2 eyewitnesses who have written down his story. You have 2 others who get it from the eyewitnesses. What about the hadith of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus? Well, in my Bible, when I open up the Gospel account, I have red letter edition. That means anytime Jesus spoke, that is the hadith of Jesus. That's the sayings of Jesus, is it not? So we not only have the sayings, but also the biography of Jesus within 60 years of his death. 2 of them written by eyewitnesses. And if you have any doubt, if there was any oral tradition, if there had been any accretions or deletions that have been added to the story, even Luke, who got it from the eyewitnesses, what does Luke say at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts? He says, "O Theophilus, I've taken it upon myself to write what you have told me." Who is he talking about? You disciples. It's the disciples that actually tell him what to write. They would have disputed if anything was incorrect, because they had been with Jesus for those 3 years. So all of the New Testament, including his life and sayings, were written within the 1st century, within 60 years of Christ's death. Now, which do you think is more authoritative? The life and sayings of Jesus, 15 to 16 years after his death, or the life and sayings of Muhammad, 200 to 300 years after his death? And the question remains, why did they have to wait 200 years? Why couldn't they have written it right away? Was there no writing at that time? Remember, by 642, within 10 years of Muhammad's death, they had taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Were there no libraries in those cities? Did people not know how to read and write in those cities? Yes, they did. By the 5th century, they had already destroyed an entire library there in Alexandria, so certainly they could have read it right. And we do know that Zayd ibn Thabit was the secretary of Muhammad. What do secretaries do? They write. If you were going to look and ask, if we were going to use the same criteria that the Muslims have for their sayings and life of their prophet and apply that to Jesus Christ, that means we would know nothing about Jesus Christ until the 3rd century. Can you imagine us trying to defend that? Now, why haven't Muslims admitted this? And why is it that nobody's questioned this? Well, they are starting to question it now. And there's a whole new school coming out of Europe, primarily in Britain and in Germany, called the revisionist school. These are Orientalists. These are experts in Islam. It's not just beginning to be. This has been going on in Germany. Men like Noldecker, Schott, These men have asked Goldziher. They have asked this very question. They've been asking it since the last century, the beginning of the last century. And they're saying, why is it no one pays attention? We all pay attention to the traditions of Jesus Christ, and we all sit there and dispute whether or not we can trust who Jesus was and what he said and what he did. But nobody asks the same question of Muhammad. Who was this Muhammad? So, who are these scholars? What are they saying? Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years, they say. And the Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Now, how did they come to that conclusion? What they're saying is the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, keep that name on your mind. Abdul Malik is the Caliph from 685 to 705. He is the one that controls the Marwanid family within the Umayyad Caliphate. He is the one that builds the Dome of the Rock. He is the pivotal person that we're going to come back to later on in the talk. But anything before Abdul Malik is probably a fabrication. Now, who are the scholars we're talking about? This is what they're asking. If so much of the history of early Islam was written down so late, then why did it take so long to write it all down? Where were these people not literate? Where did the biographers get their material from? Can it be trusted? And should we not instead go to the period these events took place? Should we not go back to the 7th century and see what we find? Now that's the logical conclusion. By the way, and all of you can have this PowerPoint, so don't feel you have to write notes because I speak way too fast. I think I outdo David Robinson when it comes to speed. So feel free to come and get this from me. I'll give it to you. You can have it, and you can use it. Just don't abuse it. Now, let's take a look. Just to remind you. Just look at the map there. Up by 661, that brown area is what Islam controlled. And I'm hesitant to even use the word Islam, as you're going to see. However, that's the area that the Arabs controlled. That was a substantial area already. They controlled quite a few big cities there. Baghdad. Can you see Baghdad? Can you see Basra? Can you see Al-Fustat, which is just outside Cairo? Mecca, Medina, Adab, Aden. In fact, all the great the oases along the Western Plateau. We'll get back to that, just to show you how much they already controlled by 660s. I bring that in there because that's going to become pivotal as we go on to this. Who are the scholars I'm going to use today? I'm going to use some of the revisionist scholars. I'm going to use Dr. John Wansborough, head of department at School of Oriental and African Studies, who wrote 2 books in the 1970s that blew this all open, called Quranic Studies and Sectarian Milieu. Those are the 2 studies, and I have them on my computer. If anybody wants to come and get me afterwards, I have a PDF on them. For the first time, asking literary questions concerning what we now know about the Quran and how the Quran could have been written that early with all the material that's in it. It must have been written at a much later age. Dr. Gerald Hunting, who I studied under at School of Oriental African Studies in 1994. Dr. Patricia Kroner, this woman was my supervisor when I began my doctorate. She was at Cambridge University at that time, head of department at that time. She reads and writes 15 languages, all archaic languages. Dr. Andrew Rippon, who was my secondary supervisor at Oxford University he was at the Oxford University, not myself, and he reads and writes 18 archaic languages. These are all linguists. Dr. Robert Hoyland, I'm sorry, not Rippon, it was Hoyland. Dr. Robert Hoyland, who is at Oxford University. Dr. Rippon is from Calgary. He is the one that's probably taken the material and written it down in layman's terminology better than anybody else. And if you want to get his book, that's probably the best one to go to. Dr. Yehuda Neva out of Jerusalem, University of Jerusalem, who has done the best work on the inscriptions, looking and seeing what exactly happened in the 7th century. And then from the German school, Dr. Lulling, Dr. Gerhard Twin, Dr. von Bothmer, and Dr. Oleg, who have been the best and probably the most pivotal on looking at the earliest manuscripts. But there are 2 new books that have just come out that you can get a hold of that you can read right now. And these 2 books have just come out in the last 2 years. One of them is In the Shadow of the Sword. Have any of you heard about this book? Okay, In the Shadow of the Sword. Get it for your library. Start to read it. It's 400 pages long. Just read the first 100 pages, and then from first page 300 to the end, because that's probably the juiciest material. Tom Holland takes all this material together. He took 6 years to go to all these scholars from 2006 up until 2012, and he put together all this material. Now, he is not an Islamicist. He's a historian. He's written 3 bestsellers. Millennium, which is the story of the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Persian Fire, which is the fall of the Persian Empire. And Rubicon, which is the fall of the Roman Empire. And that's why he is the best place to write the very next chapter, which is, of course, after those empires fell, what came next? Islam. And he was very curious as to how Islam began. And so he went around to all these different scholars and started getting the material together and put it into a book, which is any of you can read. It's now become the #1 bestseller in Islamic books last year. His paperback was number 1. His hardback was number 2. Guess what was number 3? The Quran. Outselling even the Quran. And you can be sure that no Muslims are buying this book. He also did a documentary called Islam, the Untold Story on Channel 4 on August 28, 2012. I've got it on my computer. You can come and get it from me if you want it. And it encapsulates what the book's about in 90 minutes. Now, when that came out in Channel 4, it caused such a furore amongst the Muslims that when Channel 4 wanted to reprogram it, re-show it in November of 2012, the Muslims were so angered by it that they couldn't show it a second time. And Channel 4 censored it. Isn't that sad? The other book that's come out is by Dr. Dan Gibson, Qur'anic Geography. You can get it in PDF form. It costs $15. Just put Qur'anic Geography PDF on your Google and it'll go right to this book. And he's probably the one that's asking the most damaging question. This is new material, and everything I'm sharing you today is new material. Now, what are they finding? What they're finding is that the first Arab inscriptions referencing Muhammad do not appear until 691. Now remember, he died in 632. That means there's no reference to him from within any Muslim material for 60 years. That's curious. The first reference to Muslim, the name Muslim, the people called Muslims, is not until the 690s. We don't have any reference to any people called Muslims. We have all kinds of reference to Arabs who are going and conquering Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, but they call themselves Saracens. They call themselves Hagarines. Why? Because they're in the line of Hagar. They call themselves Ishmaelites. Why? Because they're in the line of Ishmael. They call themselves Maghribites because they're from the Maghreb. And they call themselves Mahajirun. What is the Hajirun? Hijr. That means people who are in Exodus, nomadic people. These are the names they give themselves. No reference anywhere to people called Muslims for 60 years. No reference to any religion called Islam until 691, and it's first introduced on the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Here's the most devastating one. There's no reference to a city called Mecca until 741. Now stop and just think that through. No reference to a city called Mecca anywhere. It's not on any map or in any documentation until 741. Muhammad died in 632. And the first biography of Muhammad from within Muslim sources, or any sources, is not introduced until 833. That's just to encapsulate. Now you can see the significance of what I'm saying here. Let's start with the geography, and let's look and see what Dan Gibson has come up with. When you look at the Quran, and those of you who have studied the Quran, you will notice that it has about 65 geographical references, which should help you to understand where the Quran takes place. And these geographical references are important because they let you know the people that are in the Quran, what's happening around them. And over again, you get the same 3 names coming up all the time. The name Ad, the name Thamud, the name Midian. 23 times Ad comes up. 24 times the Thamud comes up. And 7 times you hear these people from the Midian. These are people who are surrounding this prophet. But we don't know the name of this prophet. He's just called the prophet, the messenger, over and over again. How many times do you think Muhammad is referred to in the Quran? 4 times. You'll find his name only 4 times in the Arabic. You'll find his name all through the English translation, but always in parentheses. Muslims have put his name in there. He's only known as the messenger, the prophet. But he's surrounded by these people from Thamud and Ad. Take a look and see where Ad and Thamud are. I wish I had a pointer here. I could point it to you. But take a look at where they are. They're over up by Petra in Jordan. That's 1,000 kilometers too far north. They should be way down here where Mecca is, right at the bottom of the map. More curious, there's no reference to this place where the prophet comes from. Now, you would assume if Muhammad is only found 4 times, by the way, how many times is Jesus referred to in the Quran? Isa, 93 times. By name. Muhammad's only referred to 4 times. Who do you think is the more important in the Quran? I'm just leaving that with you. But talk about the place where this prophet comes from. It keeps on talking about the settlement, the place, the prophet, the place where he resides. It doesn't give a name. Only once will you find the name of Mecca in the entire Quran, and that's Surah 48, Ayah 24, and it says nothing about it. It gives you no reference. What we do know by looking at the traditions, when you look at the traditions, that means the Islamic traditions, we know that this place where the prophet comes from is in a valley with a stream going through it. It has a parallel valley, a pillar of salt where the prophet goes out every morning. He passes this pillar of salt, referring to the wife of Lot, and he comes back in the evening past this pillar of salt. We heard about that this morning, didn't we? From John Lennox. Which would suggest that whoever this prophet is living where that pillar of salt is. Where do you think that pillar of salt is? Is it in Mecca? It says that this place where the prophet comes from has fields, trees, grass, clay, loam, has olive trees, mountains overlooking the Kaaba. Now, how many of you, well, none of you have been to Mecca, of course. I don't expect you. You won't be allowed to. But you have seen pictures of Mecca, and ask anybody that's been to Mecca, is there any valley in Mecca? No, Mecca is not in a valley. It doesn't have a stream going through it. It only has one source of water called the Zamzam well. It is the most arid of places. It does not have a pillar of salt outside it, but we do know where the pillar of salt comes from. The pillar of salt would be up in Jordan. Does Mecca have fields of grass, trees, clay, loam? Are there even any olive trees in Arabia? There are no olive trees in Arabia. There never have been olive trees in Arabia. The only olive trees that exist are around the Mediterranean, 1,000 kilometers further north. Mountains overlooking the Kaaba, the nearest mountains to the Kaaba is 5 kilometers away. Yet Mecca, therefore Mecca is not in a valley and has none of these listed above because it is too arid and dry. It does not fit the geographical locations the Quran is talking about. Let's talk about the Kaaba. Mentioned often. Now remember, there are many Kaabas. We have found references to Kaaba in Taif, reference to Kaaba in Tabuk, in Khaybar in the north. We found reference to Kaaba even in the south. Most oases had Kaabas. The Kaaba in Mecca is nothing unique. We have found that all we're told about it, it's the mother of all settlements. But again, doesn't give us a name, doesn't place it, doesn't show us where it is. Tradition tells us that Mecca is where Adam and Eve were sent to when they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Now remember, in the Quran, the Garden of Eden is up in space. It's not on earth. And in Surah 7, Ayah 24, they are thrown out of that garden down to Mecca according to the traditions. Which would mean it would be the oldest city in history, right? If that's where Adam and Eve were to go to. Mecca is supposedly the center of trade, north, south, east, and west. And that's what all Muslims have been telling us. And when you look and ask and say, well, if it's the center of trade, then certainly someone should have known about this place. Now, but Dr. Patricia Corona wrote a book in 1987 called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. She wanted to ask this very question because she saw some things that were curious. Take a look at that map and take a look at where the trade routes are. That's the trade routes from the 7th century. Do you see where the question mark is? That's where Mecca is today. Mecca is not on the trade route. There is no reference to any place called Mecca on any trade route map. There is a trade route that goes up the Western Plateau, and it goes through Najran. It was called Yathrib at that time. Goes and take a look what it does go through. All the trade routes seem to go through Petra in Jordan. She looked at this map, and this is a map that was drawn from the 7th century, and I wish I had a pointer again. I'm seeing if I can pull over here just for the camera's sake. If you take a look over here, you will see this is the trade route that comes up on the green line. Starting here in Aden, going to Najran, Sana, coming up to Taif. Here in Taif, it then goes down to Mecca. She looked at that, I said, hold on a minute, why does it go down 1,000 feet down to Mecca and then has to come back up 1,000 feet to get up to Yathrib again? And then to Khaybar, Tabuk, and then up to Gaza in the north. Why hadn't anybody looked at this before? She said, Mecca's not on the trade route. It doesn't make any sense. It would not be able to accommodate caravans because it didn't have any water. So she decided to write a book and ask what she could find out. So she went and she noticed that the trade route doesn't make sense. Now, according to Islamic tradition and what all the scholars have told us, the trade coming from India and China in the Far East would have come this way. It could not go up over here because of the Himalayas in the Hindu Kush. So they had to take it off board on the west coast of India and go up through the Persian Gulf, up then through the Sassanid area over into the Byzantine area. The problem was the Sassanids and the Byzantines were warring with each other for about 200 years, so that stopped the Persian Gulf. So they had to redirect the trade across the Arabian Sea, and they unshipped their goods here in Aden, and they went right up across through the Western Plateau, down to Mecca, then back up to Yathrib and on up to Gaza in the north. Do any of you see a problem with that theory? My 10-year-old son saw it right away. Let's see if you're as clever as my 10-year-old son. Is there a problem with that theory? If you're already on board ship, if you're coming across the sea here, why in the world would you take all your tons of good off here in Aden when Dr. Patricia Crone realized that if you take a ton of goods by sea, you can go 1,250 miles for the same price as only 50 miles by land? It would have been prohibitively expensive to take all these goods right across the land, 1,250 miles up here to Gaza, when you have a waterway. Why didn't they keep them on the sea, on the ship? So she went back and looked at all the trading documents. Now remember, this woman reads and writes 15 languages. She went back to all the original languages. She went back and found that over and over again, it was not Arabia. No Arabs were involved in that trade. All the names that came up were Ajalis over here. It was the Eritreans today, the Ethiopians, that controlled the trade. They were the ones that were taking the ship and were taking the goods back and forth up the Red Sea, over to from Asia, from India, and from China. No reference anywhere to Arabs for the very good reasons. The Arabs were nomadic. They were camel herders. They were not seafarers. Why hadn't anybody noticed this before? And then she realized we need to find out who knew about Mecca. Now she went back to this map again. She looked and she asked, what is it we do know about Mecca? Well, she couldn't find any reference to it. She did see that the people from Ctesiphon, which is up here, Ctesiphon, which is now to Baghdad today, came down, the Sassanids came down across the deserts and they came down to Taif, which is right here. I'm sorry, to Yathrib, and they found silver. And they put up silver mines there. And they would go down up and back between Taif and Yathrib and Tabuk, but no reference anywhere to a place called Mecca. You would have thought that they would have known about this place. It was the center of trade. No reference in any of their documentation. She went from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th century. Couldn't find any reference to Mecca. The first reference to Mecca was not till 741. On the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius Continuata Byzantia Erapica. That's the first reference you could find for a city that supposedly was the earliest city of mankind. It's where Abraham and Ishmael supposedly went to rebuild the Kaaba in 1900 BC. Why had no one heard about it until the 8th century AD? Take a look at modern Mecca today. Are you familiar with what they're building right now? That's one of the largest towers in the world, has the world's largest clock. They want to make now Mecca mean time. They want to take Greenwich Mean Time and make it Mecca Mean Time. So all our clocks are going to go to that clock. But take a look at what they're doing. That's the future, what Mecca is going to look at. That's a modern look at. Take a look what they're doing. They're basically eradicating any historical evidence. Destroying it, bulldozing it. Many Muslims are upset, but they can't do a thing about it. Why do you think they're bulldozing Mecca to build these huge buildings? What better way to destroy evidence, historical evidence, than to bulldoze it in the name of God? There is the sanctuary today. But here's the problem. Now we're going to get to the real problem. What are you going to do with the Qibla? See, the Qibla is where every Muslim must pray. You all know that. 5 times a day they must pray towards Mecca. The Qibla must pray towards this Kaaba here. Now, that was instituted in 624. It's in the Quran. Surah 2, ayah 145 to 149 says that the Qibla was redirected back to Mecca in 624, 2 years after Muhammad moved up to Medina. So from 624, every mosque must be directed towards Mecca, right? Are you following that? Today, if you want to find out where the Qibla is, they have all kinds of attractions. If you go into a mosque, you'll see the mihrab, which is right here, a niche that's put in the wall, and that's always towards Mecca. They used to use these old traps. This is my hotel room in Malaysia, then Kuala Lumpur. Every hotel room showed you where the Qibla was, so you could always do your prayers. Even as I was flying on Malaysian Airlines, that airlines made it. Every time as we were going, you could see where the Qibla was on the screen. As we were flying, the Qibla kept on changing. Do British Airlines do that too? Well, look at that. They become dhimmis. They become dhimmis. Now, today, all you need to do is get an app on your iPhone and you can find where the Qibla is. Qibla is absolutely important, and the Qibla has been around since 624. Therefore, every mosque should have been pointing towards Mecca from 624 on. Are you following me on that? Now, Surah 2, 143 to 145 talks about it. Let's take a look and see what we're now finding. Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fehervari, back in 1905, were the first to find out that there's a problem. They noticed and they went to 2 mosques in what is today Iraq and 1 mosque in what is today Egypt. And they looked at the earliest mosques that they could come across. Now, back then they had access to these mosques, and they were dug down to the original floor plans of both the Wasat Mosque and the Kufa Mosque and the Fustat Mosque in Egypt. And this is what they found. The Wasat Mosque, which is just near Baghdad, and the Kufa Mosque, which is further southwest, should have been facing straight down this Mecca. They're facing over towards Petra. The Fustat Mosque, which is over to the west, was facing east. It should have been facing south. They just said, this is curious. That's all they said. Dan Gibson wanted to do a little bit more. He wouldn't want to do a little bit more study. So Dan Gibson is an archaeologist who's been in the Middle East for about 20 years. His father was an archaeologist. His grandfather was an archaeologist. So he's grown up as an archaeologist. And he learned the language and went around to the different Bedouins, and he wanted to find out where the oldest mosques were. And rather than look and see where the mosques were today, he wanted to find out where the original floor plans, so he took satellite images, looking down on the mosque to get the original floor plans, to get the original enclosures, to see where they were facing when they were first built. Many of these built in the 7th century and the 8th century. And this is what he found. Now take a look at this one. Look at the date, 630 AD. Look where the Qibla is facing. It's facing Petra, not Mecca. Here's one he just drew of one that he did, a picture he took. Take a look where that is. That is in Jordan, southwestern Jordan. It's facing Petra, not Mecca. Here's the great mosque of Baalbek in Lebanon, facing Petra, not Mecca. Here's the great mosque in Sana'a in Yemen, facing Petra. Look at the date, 705. When did Muhammad die? 632. When was the Qibla canonized? 624. You're talking about 60 years later. It's facing Petra, not Mecca. The Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Maybe you've been there. When you look above it, take a look and see where the whole citadel is facing, including the mosque and including the Dome of the Rock. They're all facing Petra. Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built in 709. The Dome of the Rock was built in 691. Muhammad died in 632. So you're talking about 60 to 70 years later, they're all facing Petra. They're facing the wrong direction. The Damascus Mosque. Again, it's facing Petra, 709. Is it getting boring? Getting a little repetitive, isn't it? The Anjar Mosque in Lebanon in 714. Look at the date. It's facing Petra, not Mecca. The Mosque of Umar in Basra, Syria, 720. It's facing Petra, not Mecca. It's not till 727, there in Pakistan, that he finally gets a mosque that's facing Mecca. Not till 727. But then in 728, they don't know where to face. They're not facing Petra or Mecca. Now here's a curious one. This is rather interesting. Here is the mosque that is, we're looking now at the Amman Mosque in Jordan. There are two mosques. Here's one down here. That's the older mosque that's built in 700. This is the newer mosque that's built in 740. The older mosque in 700 is facing Petra. The newer mosque up here is facing Mecca. They finally got it correct. But look at the date. 740. That's 120 years too late. The Mushafs Mosque in Amman, 743. There again, it's facing Petra. They still haven't made up their mind. The Ribat Forest. Now, once you get to North Africa, there seems to be something wrong with all the North African mosques. They're not facing Petra or Mecca. They have a completely different delineation for their Qibla. There's 77 in Tunisia, neither facing Mecca or Petra. The same thing with Spain. Here's the mosque in Cordoba. Look at the date, 784. It's neither facing Petra nor Mecca. They're very confused in Northern Africa. And of course, the great Mosque of Karawan in Tunisia in 870, it's not facing Petra or Mecca, but they're all facing the same uniform direction. That's what's also curious. What is his conclusions? Up until 725, every mosque is facing Petra. Muhammad died in 632. The Qibla was canonized in 624. Up 100 years later, they're all facing Petra. And then for the next 100 years, there seems to be a confusion. 12% are facing Petra, 50% start to begin to face Mecca, 38 aren't sure where they're supposed to face, and then finally in 822, all the mosques begin to face Mecca. Not till 822 do all the mosques face Mecca. Now, is it that they didn't know their directions? Now remember, these were Arabs. These were nomadic people. They had caravans that went across the deserts. They had no roads at that time. How did they find their way? Through stars. You cannot tell me they didn't know their direction. And what's more, every mosque that he looked up until 725 are all facing Petra uniformly. If they didn't know their way, there'd be all kinds of different directions. And it's from 725 that there seems to be a confusion. And that's why you have the North African mosques facing a completely different direction. What's the significance of Petra? Why Petra? What do we know about Petra? How many people have been to Petra? Anybody here? None of you? Okay. Well, Petra, if you go there, it's a city of what? It's a city of tombs and temples. It is the seat of the Nabatean kingdom. The Nabateans are the precursors to Arabia. They are the ones from whence we get the Arabic language. That's where we get the name Allah. Allah is a Nabatean god. Interestingly, Allah, the name of the Nabatean god, has a wife named Alat. And the wife has two daughters, Al-Manat and Al-Uzza. Al-Manat and Al-Uzza are the wife of Alat and Allah. Ooh, I love that. Because that's written in Surah 53, Ayah 19 and 20. It's known as satanic verses in the Quran. Refers to Alat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza. Which suggests, therefore, that Allah is polytheistic, if he has a wife and two daughters. Yet what do we hear Muslims say who Allah is? He is one. He has no wife. Surah 6, Ayah 105 is very clear. He has no wife. Allah has no sons, Surah 4, Ayah 171. Then what is he doing with two daughters? Ooh, I love it. Makes my job a lot easier. Let's get back to Petra. Take a look at Petra. And what do we know about Petra? Petra is in a valley, is it not? If any of you have seen the movie Indiana Jones, you remember there, when they come out of that fissure, there's Petra right in front of you. It's in a valley, in a steep valley. It has a stream going through it. It has a parallel valley. It also has fields, trees, grass, clay, loam. It has olive trees. It is near the pillar of salt. Everything the Quran speaks about fits Petra. Yet Petra is 1,000 kilometers further north, nowhere near Mecca. I just leave that with you. Can you now understand why all the mosques are facing Petra and not Mecca? Now, so what do we know? There's nothing that we know about Muhammad until the 7th century. He is referred to outside of Muslim sources, interestingly. We have the Doctrine of Iacobi in the British Library that refer to him by name. We have the writings of Sabaeus, the Dr. Iacobi from 634. We have the writings of Sabaeus from 670 that also refer to him, 670 to 680. So there is references to him outside of Muslim sources, but there's no reference anywhere that he has given a book called the Quran, or that he is the head of or beginning of a movement called Islam, or that he is a Muslim. None of that in any of these sources. And the only Muslim sources that start to introduce this is not till 691, the time of Abdul Malik. It's Abdul Malik that introduces the name Muhammad as a prophet. It's Abdul Malik that introduces the name Muslim. It's Abdul Malik that introduces the name Islam. And they're introduced on the Dome of the Rock. And when you look at the Dome of the Rock, the only part of the original part of the building that still exists today are the inner ambulatories. When you look at the inscriptions along the inner ambulatories, you will see they are Arabic inscriptions and they are Quranic inscriptions, and they are all attacking Jesus Christ. The earliest inscriptions of any people called Muslims is a rejection of Jesus' divinity. Isn't that interesting? Can you see what we're up against? Thus, much of what we know about Muhammad is written down hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away, starting from 833. His city isn't referred to until the mid-8th century. His biography don't appear until the 9th century. It looks like he is nothing more than a later redaction, possibly begun by Abdul Malik. Now, what about the Quran? And here's what really gets juicy. This is my favorite stuff. And if you remember anything today, remember this part. Because this is where I think we're going to, all the battle is going to come around. What do Muslims say about the Quran? Well, the Quran is the greatest wonder among the wonders of the world, as they say. This book is second to none in the world according to the unanimous decision of the learned men in points of diction, style, rhetoric, thoughts, and soundness of law, and regulations to shape the destinies of mankind. That's from the Mishkat al-Matsubi, which is a compilation of the 6 most authoritative hadith, starting with Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, and the others. They claim that it is the most superior of all revelations. Will they say, Muhammad hath forged it? Answer, bring therefore a chapter like unto it, and call whom you are to seek assistance besides Allah. I remember when I was doing a debate with Sheikh Umar Bakri Muhammad at Trafalgar Square, he asked me to get up on the plinth there. There's about 5,000 Muslims. And he said, Mr. Smith, you have a problem with my Quran. Let's have a debate right now. Just right on the top, in front of 5,000 Muslims, he asked me to do a debate. So we started this debate. We went for about 45 minutes. And finally he said this to me. Well, okay, if you have a problem with the Quran, then bring therefore a chapter like it. So I took out my Bible, I opened up to Psalm 23, and I started reading Psalm 23 into the microphone. They turned off the microphone. Now, you don't do that to me because I've got a very loud voice. And I just stood forward and used my speaker's corner voice, finished off Psalm 23, turned to him and says, now you show me a chapter like that in the Quran. Show me anything that can equal Psalm 23. I could have gone to Psalm 1. I could have gone to Psalm 2. I could have gone to any Psalm. I could have gone to Matthew 5. I could have gone to 1 Corinthians 13. I could have gone to any one of my chapters and read it, and it is superior to anything you're going to find in the Quran. So when Muslims ask you this, take them on board and just open up your Bible and read it to them. And then ask them the same question. Show me anything that is superior to that in the Quran. That's the beauty of our Bible. We can take that challenge, and we're the only ones that can take that challenge. Now, here's the 4 questions I want to ask. I want you to ask your Muslim friends. The next time you meet your Muslim friends, go up to them and ask them these 4 questions. They're very simple. Ask them, first of all, is the Quran eternal? What would they say? Christian, what would they say? Absolutely. Every Muslim, whether they are radical, moderate, or liberal, they have to say the Quran is eternal. Secondly, was it complete at the time of Uthman? What would they say? Absolutely. I've never heard a Muslim ever didn't say other. They would not dare say other, because if it was not complete at the time of Uthman, then they've got a problem. Thirdly, is it the same Quran that we have today as the time of Uthman? Absolutely. The Quran has not changed. And that is one of their primal attacks against the Bible. The Bible has been changed, it's been corrupted, but not the Quran. Every verse, every chapter, every letter is exactly the same today as it was in that eternal tablet that's in heaven. And the eternal tablet is referred to in Surah 85, ayah 22. So the Quran itself makes that claim. All right? Ask just those three questions. And then number 4, prove it. Is it eternal? Was it complete? Is it unchanged? Then prove it. See what happens. Now, for those of you who have worked with Muslims, what has been the response when you ask them to prove it? What manuscript do they have today that's complete and exactly the same that we have today? Because you're asking them is, show me a complete manuscript from the 7th century that is complete and unchanged, exactly like the Quran we have in our hand today. What do they say? Anybody know when you've asked any of those kind of questions? Christian, you know what they say. Beth? They always talk about 2 manuscripts. The Topkapi and the Samarkand, they're right there on the screen. Those are the 2 they always come up with. The Topkapi is the Topkapi manuscript that's in Turkey, there in the Topkapi Museum, that was written by Uthman. It has his bloodstains on it. You can see his bloodstains. He was reading it when he was killed. And then the Samarkand, which is in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan. Now, according to Al-Bukhari, that writes and gives us reference, he says in volume 6, hadith number 509 and 510, he says that 3 men, along with Zayd ibn Thabit, were given responsibility to write it down in 650. And then after they were to write it down, Uthman took all the other copies that existed and burned them. There it is. They had to burn them. This is right out of the hadith of Al-Bukhari. Okay? They burnt all the other copies. Sahih Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 510. So that this last one then was retained and then sent to the other provinces. And that means 4 were sent to 4 different cities. Medina, Basra, Baghdad, and Damascus. Where are those Uthmanic copies? Just ask them that. Where are those Uthmanic copies? They'll say they're in Turkey and in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Here's been the problem. We have not been given access to either of those copies. We can't get it. In fact, we have not been given access to the earliest 6 manuscripts. These are not the only 2 manuscripts. There are 4 other manuscripts that are always given. And the other 4 manuscripts are the Huzayni manuscript, which is in Cairo, in Egypt. The Ma'al manuscript, which is the only one we have had access to, which is in the British Library in London. The Petropolitanist manuscript, which is in Paris. That one François de Roche controls in Paris. And then the most exciting one is the Sana manuscript, which was discovered in 1976 and was looked at for the first time in 1981, which is in Yemen. Sana in Yemen. Those are the 6 major manuscripts. The Topkapi, the Samarkand, the Huzayni, the Ma'il, the Petropolitanist manuscript, and then the Sana manuscript. And those are the only 6 manuscripts you're going to hear about. Have anybody heard of any other manuscripts besides them? They're supposed to be Uthmanic. All right? So let's deal with those 6 manuscripts. Well, we can't. We can't have access to them. However, in 2002, 2 gentlemen were finally given access to these manuscripts. Dr. Tal Altukulic and Dr. Ihsanoglu. They are both responsible for the Topkapi manuscript. And what I want to do is I want to start and look and see what their conclusions are. Now remember, Islam had expanded up to 661, so they controlled all the cities of that area. They had all kinds of libraries, they had all kinds of writing material, and certainly there's no reason why they could not write down manuscripts, because they had great cities at their disposal. But by the time that Abdul Malik comes to power, by the time of 685, they controlled all the way from Spain in the west to India in the east. That whole swath of land was under their control. So they had an awful lot of material, peoples who were literate. Are you following me on that? Let's look at the Topkapi manuscript. Now that's a picture of the Topkapi manuscript. There, if you look carefully, you can see the bloodstains of Uthman right there. Take a look at it and you can see there's some problems with it immediately. First of all, the script is rather wrong, but let's look and see what Professor Dr. Ekmeluddin Ihsanoglu, Founding Director General of the IRCICA from 1980 to 2004, as Secretary General of the Organization of the Islamic Conference Research Center. He says, we have no Uthmanic Mushafs. None of them exist. Nor do we have any of the copies from those Mushafs. Mushafs means manuscripts. These Mushafs date from the later Umayyad period. The Umayyad period goes from 661 up to 749, so mid-8th century. But it's Dr. Tayyip Altukulic, who is much more the scholar, leading scholar in Quranic studies, ex-president of Turkish Religious Affairs, deputy of the Turkish Parliament. He says there have been no serious scholarly work been done on them. These Mushafs, these manuscripts, date from the early to mid-8th century. Not one of them is from the 7th century. They are not Uthmanic, nor are they copies sent by him. And what's more, they are full of manuscript variants. The Topkapi itself, he says, has 2,270 consonantal differences. Not vowelization. There's no vowelization in that copy. Vowelization had not yet been invented. The Dhamma, the Kasra, the Fatha, that had not yet been introduced. The diacritical marks were just beginning to be introduced. He's saying consonantal difference, 2,270. And what's more, it's not complete. Now they came up with Al-Musaf al-Sharif. I've got it on my computer, if any of you want a copy of it. This is their findings that came out in 2007. I was only introduced to it last year, a year ago from now. It was sent to me finally in English. We now have their conclusions. And this is what they're saying. The Samarkand, which is also considered to be a sister manuscript, take a look at it and you can see it's what we call a monumental manuscript. It's a much bigger manuscript. These were only introduced in the late 8th century and the early 9th century. This one here, he dates to the mid-8th century, not at all to the 7th century. He says it is not Uthmanic as it dates to the mid-8th century for 6 reasons. It has undisciplined spelling, it has different writing styles, it has scribal mistakes, it has copyist mistakes, it's written by someone with little experience, and it has later additions. It only goes up to Surah 43. There are 114 surahs in the Quran. Half the Quran's missing. Yet every Muslim will tell you the Samarkand and the Topkapi are complete and exactly the same as we have today. Finally, the Muslim scholars are telling us what they now know. This is the first Muslim scholars. Now remember, these are the only Muslim scholars that have been given access to the manuscripts. In fact, they are the only ones. There are no one else who has had access to these manuscripts. So we're getting it from the horse's mouth. All right, are you following that? When they looked at the Huzayni manuscript, they said, again, this is another monumental text. These ones actually were only introduced in the 9th century. Dr. Francois de Roche, who's considered the world scholar, the world authority in the European world, he dates this to the 9th century. They date it to around the early to mid-8th century. That's Dr. Francois de Roche there. He is responsible for the Paris Presbyterianist manuscript. He dates that to the early 8th century. He says it has corrections to the text. It disagrees with the Cairene Musaf in 93 places. It has 5 different copyists. It's later modified with erasures and additions, and it only contains 26% of the Quran. So why are Muslims claiming that this is complete? Almost 3/4 of the Quran's missing out of it. Those are some more of his quotes. For those who get the PowerPoint, you can have it. The Ma'al Quran, which is in Britain, which is there in the British Library, we've known about for quite a few years. It only contains 53% of the Quran. It is full of manuscript variants, and that's why, and its date for that is the late 8th century. That's about 150 years after Muhammad. The Sana manuscript, which is proving to be the most exciting because it was the latest to be discovered. The Germans are now looking at it and they're finding and they're saying that this manuscript only begins to be written down in 705. However, it's full of manuscript variants. This is a copy of one by Gerhard Print. I went to see him in Germany, and if you look over here, you can see Surah 19, then it jumps to Surah 22. I'm sorry, Surah 19, after that yellow mark, it jumps to Surah 22. What happened to Surah 20 and 21? Surah 20 begins over here, but you can see there are 2 different scripts. Can you see that? This is a much later script. This is about 60 years between these 2 scripts. This is 705. This is much later in the 8th century. This is written about the time of Abdul Malik, or going into Al-Walid, who is his son, who was ruled from 705 to 715. What's more, when you look at the manuscript under ultraviolet light, you can see that there's a script underneath it. This is called a palimpsest. Now they're starting to look at these palimpsests, and in New York and also the Sorbonne in France, they're now pulling away the script underneath, and they're finding that there's a Quranic script underneath that is different than the one that is on top. And we're looking for the first time, and they're dating the underscript to around the late 7th century. That's the earliest Quranic material we can find. It's the last 2 decades of the 7th century. Who was ruling in the last 2 decades of the 7th century? Abdul Malik. This is one of his. This is the earliest reference we can find to any Quranic material. Then it's rewritten again over top. And that's the material that you see there. And the 2 don't agree. Ooh, I love this. That's the first reference we have to a evolution in the Quranic script. So what are their conclusions? Dorosh, Bowring, Conrad, Peter, Stein, Shoemaker, and I could go on and on. Those of the Western scholars who have had access to it conclude that the earliest Mushafs begin to appear in the 8th century, not at all in the 7th century. The Muslim scholars like Professor Ekmeluddin Ihsanuddin and Dr. Tahir Altıkılıç conclude that the earliest Mushafs begin to appear in the 8th century. They agree with the Western scholars. Islamic Awareness website, which is the largest Muslim website that deals now with manuscripts, they are probably the most conservative website. They're the ones that we've had to deal with for the last 10 to 15 years. They have finally now agreed that all the earliest manuscripts are 8th century. How can they disagree? Because even their scholars are telling them that. Finally, and one of their primary scholars comes to Speaker's Corner every Sunday. And I confronted him in July last year with this material. And I held up these pictures and I said, Mansour, this is your material. I'm taking it off your website. Every one of these manuscripts is from the 8th century. Not one of them is from the 7th century. And I turned to him, and he was filming me at the time. And I said, Mansour, I want you to show me a complete, unchallenged or unchanged manuscript from the 7th century. You can't use these anymore. He closed up his camera and walked out of Speaker's Corner, and he's not talked to me since. That was in July last year. The next week I held it up again, and I was showing some a huge crowd of Muslims, and some Albanian Muslims came up, and they just started punching me, and I got knocked off the ladder. My glasses went flying, and then one guy got his hand all bloody, and I had blood all over me, and the police had to come and arrest him, and I kept up, and I just went and held it up again. I said, you can punch me all you want. You've got to deal with this material. Punching me will not answer the question. You've got to deal with this material. Now, last October, Dr. Yassin Dutton, considered to be the world authority on Qur'anic manuscripts, came to London, had a meeting at School of Oriental and African Studies, and the title of his lecture was, When Does the Uncanonical Become Canonical? When does the non-canonical become canonical? Ooh, I love that. He put up 12 slides taken from Surah 19, from a manuscript in Birmingham. He put up 12 slides. Each slide had manuscript variants. He said these are dated from the time of Al-Walid, from 705 to 750. So we're talking about a good 60 to 70 years after Uthman. And every one of them had manuscript variants. One slide had 8 manuscript variants on just that one slide, showing that there were corrections, deletions, accretions. And he just kept on showing us slide after slide. There was an electricity in the air. Most of the people in the audience were Muslims. And there was a Muslim woman who was right at the front. In the question and answer period, she was a convert to Islam. She had a hijab on. She was shaking. She was so angry. She says, please, please don't tell me that the Quran was still being changed, still being corrected in 715. He says, I'm not telling you a thing. I'm just showing you what we're discovering. Now, sitting next to me was Dr. Walid Saleh. Dr. Walid Saleh is head of department for Islamic Studies at Toronto University. Shabir Ali, one of the world's, they considered to be the world's best debater, got his doctorate from Dr. Saleh, and I just had met him at the break. He was sitting next to me. I turned to him after because they would not take my hand. I had my hand up there all the time, and they would not look at me. And so finally I turned to Dr. Walid Saleh. I said, okay, you've seen what's on the wall there. You now know that all the earliest manuscripts do not appear until the 8th century. He said, that's true. I said, well, now help me here. Do you still believe there was an Uthmanic recension? Do you still believe there was a Quran at the time of Uthman? He said, yes, absolutely. I said, well, what happened to them if they don't begin to appear until in the 8th century, 60 years later? He said, maybe they were lost. Perhaps they were destroyed. Maybe they were burned. I said, okay, help me here. I said, you're telling me that you were sent 4 copies. One was left in Medina, one was sent to Basra, Baghdad, Damascus. That these 4 copies were left in cities that you controlled, and for 1,400 years you controlled those 4 cities. They're still under your control today. I haven't heard of any fire. I've heard of no destruction of any manuscripts. I've never heard of any reference anywhere that they were lost. But let's just say, hypothetically, that they were destroyed or lost. What you're telling me is that for 60 years, you Muslims did nothing. And then 60 years later, at the time of Al-Walid, you decided, now let's write the Quran now, and let's write it down. And you made 6 manuscripts that we now have today. Not one of those 6 manuscripts is complete, and not one of them agrees with each other, and not one of them agrees with the Quran we have today. So I said, listen, really, are you suggesting, therefore, that the Quran was only recreated, rewritten in the 8th century? Then I said, then what did Muhammad have to do with the Quran, and who is Muhammad? He looked at his watch, he said, I really got somewhere to go, if you excuse me, and he just left. Now, this is one of the leading scholars in the Islamic world. He is considered to be one of the world scholars on the Quran. He could not even answer the most direct question. Can you see the problem they're going to have? How would you answer this if you're a Muslim? And all we need to ask them is 4 questions. Is the Quran eternal? Was it complete at the time of Uthman? Is it unchanged even today? Prove it. Ooh, I love it. Anybody can ask these questions. You can ask them of your own friends. We are now asking them at Speaker's Corner. How do I conclude? Muslims cannot prove that there are any complete manuscripts in the time of Uthman. They cannot prove that it is eternal. It was not complete at the time of Uthman in 650 now, 650. The Quran has changed since 650, as we've seen from all the earliest manuscripts. Thus, since the above 4 are proven and the earliest Mushafs begin to appear in the 8th century, then Muhammad had little to do with the Quran. So then, who created the Quran? One of our scholars in our Qibla just got his doctorate last month. He has been going around the world looking at the 200 earliest manuscripts of the Quran. He was hoping to find manuscript variants. He was hoping to find 2 or 3 here and there. He has now just received his doctorate, just finished his doctorate a month ago. His book is coming out next month. He has found thousands of manuscript variants in every manuscript he looked at. And he has documented every one. It's coming out next month. Ooh, this is going to make my job so much easier. Can you see what we have going for us? Can you see how we can destroy Islam historically? Starting with the academic world. Now stop and think of yourself. This was done to our Bible, was it not, back in the 1800s? Tübingen, with Wellhausen, asked the very same questions. Good questions. These are great questions. This is exactly what should have been asked of us. We need to have our Bible confronted. And it was great that it was confronted back then. By 1905, look and see how it decimated the church. Not only historical criticism, but Darwinianism, the 2 of them decimated the church in Europe, and the church has yet to recover. We can now ask the same questions of Islam. For the first time, we're getting the same questions asked of the Quran, and asked of the Prophet Muhammad, and asked of the emergence of Islam, using the same criteria: redacted criticism, source criticism, historical criticism, literary criticism, and yes, manuscript criticism. But we can go a lot quicker. We've got the internet. We've got YouTube. This material that I'm introducing you today, I'm going to debate on September 27th with Shabir Ali, the world's best Muslim debater. He has now agreed to debate me in Toronto. We're going to introduce this material in Toronto. But I'm going to have even better material because of the new book that's coming out. How would you answer this if you're a Muslim? And what would you do with this material if you now know that everything you thought was eternal, everything you thought came from a man named Muhammad, who is the model for all of mankind? Remember, the radical Muslims look at this as divine text. It cannot be critiqued because it comes from heaven itself. Now we're saying it had nothing to do with Muhammad. It didn't even exist at the time of Muhammad. It didn't even exist in his century. And when it did exist, it didn't agree with the Quran we have today. It's been redacted over and over again. In fact, we can't find a complete Quranic manuscript until the 10th century. Until the 10th century, that's 300 years later. What would you do in their place? Can you understand how this will have huge ramifications once we get this into the YouTube, down to the seminaries, down into the madrasas, and down into the mosques? It's not going to destroy Islam, no. Don't have any, it's not the silver bullet that's going to destroy Islam, but it's going to destroy the credibility for the Quran. And it's got to destroy the credibility for Muhammad. What does this was left to Islam if the Quran and Muhammad are destroyed? Thank God we don't have these problems. Thank God I don't have to ask these kinds of questions. Thank God I don't make these kind of claims. I would never claim the Bible's eternal. Would you? We know who wrote it. We give the names to the people who wrote each book. We know when they were written. We know exactly where the manuscript variants are. We admit that there are manuscript variants. We even write it in the margin, and we warn the readers, these verses, the last part of Mark 16 from verse 9 to 20, are not found in the earliest manuscripts. John chapter 7 verse 53 to John 8:11. This verse of the women being stoned to death, we don't find in our earliest manuscripts. We say it. We have nothing to hide. That's why I love my Bible. But that's why we need to start getting this out into the public sphere. Let Muslims hear this and let them come to conclusion, and let's bring them home.